Okay, in Matthew 26, we are going to transition into sort of the happenings before Jesus went to the cross. And so this one's a long one. Let me just highlight this chapter before you read it. First of all, there's a plot to kill Jesus. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover day begins in 2 days, and the Son of Man," that's how he referred to himself, "will be handed over to be crucified." And then we see in verse 3 that sort of this other scene in another place, we see that the Jewish leaders are beginning to plot his death. So let's just jump through this real quick. Then Jesus gets anointed at Bethany. While he was eating, a woman came in with a beautiful alabaster jar of expensive perfume and poured it over his head. And so you can read for yourself how the disciples responded to that. All of this, again, is in preparation for Jesus going to the cross. In the next section, it says Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, went to the leading priests, and then he basically made a deal with them to betray Jesus. The next scene is the Last Supper. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and they said, "Hey, where do you want us to prepare the Passover meal for you?" Now, as you read this, I just want to make sure that you understand that what Jesus was doing with the Passover meal, and that was a meal that they had understood and practiced since the Old Testament times, right? But Jesus is going to give that meal new meaning. He's going to give it a new definition, because it turns out that that drink, the wine, isn't representative of the blood in the Old Testament. It's representative of his blood, and the bread is representative of his body. Now, this should sound familiar, because if you go to a Christian church, you probably take communion there, and this is really where it started. This is the symbolism of communion, and he's connecting it into his purpose, his death, his resurrection. In the next section, Jesus predicts that Peter's going to deny him. And then we see the scene where they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus went to this olive grove, and he said, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took a few of the disciples with him to go pray. And it says that he goes on a little bit further, and he bowed down and he prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." Now, I think what's interesting about this is even Jesus sometimes prayed for something that didn't actually happen. So he prays that this cup of suffering would be taken away, but as you're going to find out, that cup of suffering was not taken away. So don't be discouraged if your prayers aren't all answered, because even Jesus here prayed a certain thing to the Father and it didn't get answered. But I like his attitude, and this is the attitude that we should have in prayer. He says, "Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." So let's scroll just a little bit further. Then Jesus is betrayed. He gets arrested. Judas, one of the 12 disciples, arrives with a crowd of men armed with swords and clubs. And they had been sent by the leading priests and the elders of the people. And Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. Jesus is ready for it. Again, you can read this for yourself. And I told you that this would be a long chapter. Verse 57, he goes before the council. This is the Jewish high council, where he starts to get on trial. Now, this whole trial was a sham. It turns out they were falsely accusing him, but Jesus was ready for it. And then in verse 69, we see that meanwhile, Peter was sitting outside the courtyard, and a servant girl came over and said, "Hey, wait, you were one of those with Jesus the Galilean." And Peter denies Jesus 3 times, just like Jesus had predicted that he would. So again, long chapter, 75 verses long, lots of groundwork is being laid for what we're going to see in the next couple of chapters when Jesus goes to the cross and dies there for our sins. So you're ready to read Matthew 26 for yourself, and we'll see you tomorrow for chapter 27.